you never really know what is going on inside someone's house. On the outside, homes present the ordinary, if not boring, story of everyday life. However, if you were to open that front door, that mundane image may be shattered in an instant. It's estimated that 2.6% of the United States population has a hoarding disorder. This varies in intensity. It can start off simple, a stack of books you swear you're gonna read, a few overfilled totes collecting dust in the corner, piles of clothes you're gonna go through later, anything of this sort. But this can quickly spiral into a nightmare. Piles of clutter that crowd hallways, entire rooms lost to an ocean of junk, a mess that can even find its way to the outside world. And a lot of the time, this stuff is exactly what it appears to be, junk. Junk of no material or sentimental value. But even so, it remains in someone's home as it continues to grow. This condition first grabbed mainstream interest through the A&E TV show Hoarders. Premiering on August 17, 2009, it has aired over 160 episodes that give a unique look into the life of a person who suffers with hoarding disorder. However, the act of hoarding did not begin with the TV show. It dates back very far in history. The Collyer Brothers. Homer and Langley Collyer spent their lives in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. For 38 years, they lived alone in a 4-story brownstone building, and they spent these 38 years collecting junk. All 4 floors of their brownstone mansion were stacked to the ceiling with stuff. It got to the point that they had to traverse through their home by means of tunnels and pathways carved out through their gargantuan hoard. Several people attempted to break into the Collyer mansion, so it was fortified. Windows had gridiron welded on, doors had their handles tied shut, and most shockingly, traps were set up through the house's tunnels, which, when triggered, would collapse onto any would-be intruder. As they got older, they were hardly seen in public. Their decrease in appearances led to several grisly rumors spreading about them both. Rumors that weren't entirely untrue. There is so much more to discuss in today's video. The story of the Collyer brothers is a tragic one, with many strange twists and turns throughout. Without further ado, this is the story of the Collyer Mansion, history's first hoarder house. Before the Collyer brothers became a name synonymous with overabundance, they were raised in New York City by their parents, Susie and Herman Collyer. Not starting off on a good foot, Susie and Herman were first cousins. Both of them claimed to descend from the Livingston family, a well-known group that first emigrated to America in 1672. Susie was an opera singer, and she met Herman while he was interning at Bellevue, the oldest public hospital in New York City. The two lived in a cold-water flat in Upper Manhattan. A cold-water flat was a term for an apartment with no modern conveniences, most notably being hot water, hence the term cold-water flat. This is the start of a long trend present through the Collyer family's life. They did not like to spend money, even when they had plenty to spend. Regardless of the house's quality, Herman and Susie would start a family in that cold-water flat. They had their first child on May 1st, 1880. A little girl, who was named after her mom. Unfortunately, she would pass away 3 months later on August 15th. In the following year, they would give birth to their first son, Homer, on November 6, 1881. 4 years after this, they would give birth to their second son, Langley. The 4 lived together in their flat while the boys progressed through their schooling. Both of them were incredibly smart and gifted, excelling through their studies. At the age of 14, Homer was offered enrollment at the College of New York City. 6 years later, he had a bachelor's degree. Both of the brothers were closer with their mom. Herman thought his boys were too educated and they should slow down a bit, while Susie pushed him to excel. She taught Langley how to play the piano, and she encouraged Herman to go as far as he wanted with his education. Both Homer and Langley attended Columbia University as well. Homer studied law, and Langley studied both engineering and chemistry. It was about this time, in 1909, when Dr. Herman Collyer was considering moving his family. The Harlem neighborhood of Manhattan was expanding, growing much larger as the 1800s came to a close. Herman monitored this closely, and right as a new apartment building came in, he bought one all for himself. The building was a 4-story brownstone located at 2078 Fifth Avenue, the future site for the Collyer collection. But that's down the line. Now living in Harlem, the boys continued their education. Susie would perform on occasion, but was slowing down as she got older. And Dr. Herman Collyer continued his practice as a gynecologist. He was recently offered a job at the City Hospital on Blackwell Island, located right there. Dr. Collyer lived there. So every morning, Collyer would walk to the East River with a canoe over his head. He would then put it in the water before paddling over to his workplace in the mornings. Other than this, the family were pretty normal people, especially to outsiders who knew of them through the community. Both Homer and Langley taught Sunday school at Trinity Church, the same one their parents attended their entire lives. Langley also furthered his piano skills, performing at several venues just the same as his mother. However, certain secrets and oddities were buried deep behind the doors of the mansion located at 2078 Fifth Avenue. And just as the new century continued to push forward, that door would open, and the people of New York City would get an uncomfortable front row view of how the Collyers really lived their lives. Let's start by painting a scene of where the Collyers were now living. We mentioned before that they had moved into a brownstone building at 2078 Fifth Avenue. Brownstones were in style at this time and were all over New York City. However, these brownstones were not typically something owned and lived in by a single family. They had multiple floors that were broken up into apartments for multiple families to live in. This is not how the Collyers were living in the brownstone. They had other similar brownstone buildings connected to their own that were broken up into apartments, but the four of them opted to keep the entire building to themselves. The next 10 years saw nothing of major note. Homer kept a few different jobs centered around his law degree, while Langley would perform piano recitals. He would also take his mom downtown to the opera. As for Susan and Herman, they were facing their own troubles, one surrounding their home and their marriage. Herman wanted to move his family again so that the brownstone building could be converted into a sanitarium, a type of hospital that specialized in long-term care. Susan wanted no part of this, which ended in the two getting a divorce. In 1919, Herman moved to a house at 153rd West 77th Street. Here it is on a map, versus where the Collyer brownstone was. Despite this massive gap, Dr. Collyer would travel to the brownstone building every day to see the boys, or Langley and Homer would go see him. They remained close with their father, up until his death, which came 6 years later in 1923. He fell ill and passed away soon after. One of his patients bought his house, and they informed Homer and Langley about what was inside. A tremendous amount of stuff. It was mostly contained to the basement, and the pile included thousands of medical books and documents, his rowboat he paddled across the river with, and, most notably, a disassembled Model T, which sat in pieces. When the brothers found out about this, they opted to take it all. Piece by piece, the collection was moved to the brownstone. The Model T was placed in their own basement, and the rowboat was placed in the attic. Dr. Herman Collyer was buried in the Cypress Hill Cemetery, located in Brooklyn, where his ex-wife was about to join him. Susan Collyer would pass away in 1929. For some strange reason that no one knows the answer as to why, the brothers carried her body through their parlor window in the middle of the night, burying her next to Herman. Now, the Collyer brothers were isolated orphans. Everything both parents owned was left to the brothers, and they kept it all. This was the first piece of a collection that would eventually consume all 4 stories of the Collyer mansion. In 1932, Claremont Morris received some visitors at his workplace, Farmers Loan and Trust Company. He accepted them, and in walked 2 figures who were dressed half a century out of date. They were wearing old-fashioned clothes, Gates Ajar collars, old high-time socks, and strange hats. Morris also described their old shoes, whose soles were ran paper thin, worn from perhaps decades of use. The brothers were inquiring about a property, one just across the street from their own, a building at 2077 Fifth Avenue. They intended to buy it and convert it into apartments. And right then and there, they handed over $7,500 in cash, a modern-day equivalent of $177,000. That sealed the deal, and the Collyer brothers now owned another building, adding to their real estate portfolio. It should be noted that the brothers also owned 9 acres of land on Long Island. This was purchased in 1870 by their father Herman, and the brothers inherited it when he passed away. And now, they own the building right across from them, 2077 Fifth Avenue. After their purchase went through, the brothers became friends with Morris, and he was perhaps the only person willingly let into their own home. This is where the extent of their hoarding became known. In the 4 years since their mom had died, the brothers added on to their collection, and now, it was a disaster. Morris described the house as an old Egyptian tomb, filled to the brim with junk. It was difficult to navigate, and he claimed to have seen 10 pianos scattered across the entire house. Morris stepped over old piles of wood, scattered collections of car parts, and so many endless stacks of newspaper. The house was also pitch black. This is because the Collyer brothers stopped paying for all of their utilities. Starting in 1917, they stopped paying their phone bill, claiming they had no one to talk to. The gas and electric went next. The brothers relied on massive, old wool coats to stay warm, alongside multiple layers of other clothing. The brothers also navigated their house with oil lamps and cooked with kerosene heaters. For their water, they opted to go to public sources, like parks, fill up buckets to bring them back for their use. For their bathroom use, let's just say they had plenty of empty buckets, jars, and bottles. And again, let me just say, the brothers were not poor by any means. We just mentioned how they handed over $7,500 in cash to buy an apartment building, yet they didn't spend any on their utilities, instead letting them get shut off. They also avoided spending money on their food, instead opting to go to butcher shops who were about to close down, and they would essentially beg for anything they could get given. They would also scour trash cans for food that was thrown out before they deemed it to be too bad. They would cut around the rotten parts and eat what was left. Later in this same year, Morris received a knock at his door at 10 p.m. He opened it to see the Collyers. They visited him at his Gramercy Park house, where they stayed until 2 in the morning, discussing all sorts of topics from art to music to literature. When the brothers got up to leave, Morris insisted on seeing them home, not knowing they were planning to walk home, a pace of 100 blocks in Harlem at 2 in the morning, all in an attempt to avoid paying a cab fare. But when the brothers got home, they discovered a terrible sight. Their house was broken into, and from this point forward, the brothers would never leave the house at the same time. But Homer was about to never leave the house again. In 1932, he had a stroke. This affected his vision, which slowly dwindled over the next few years. Morris would see him out one last time in 1934, and he walked the block with him. Homer revealed how he was losing his vision and how he would never leave the house again, a promise he upheld. His vision would be entirely gone by fall of 1934. Neither Langley or Homer wanted him to be taken to a hospital. They were concerned that the doctors would sever his optical nerve, leading to permanent blindness with no hopes to restore it. The brothers instead opted to cure Homer's blindness by home remedies and rest. Langley kept Homer on a very strict diet, 100 oranges a week. You must remember, we are the sons of a doctor. We have a library of 15,000 medical books in the house. We know too much about medicine, Langley would later tell the press. This caused the brothers to retreat further from the public eye. Homer would never leave, and Langley would stay inside to take care of him. Their only major connection to the outside was a crystal radio built by Langley. As for Homer, he was stuck inside a mansion of junk, unable to see his plenty surroundings. Life was reduced to one long dialogue with his brother. In the 1930s, the New York City press was being dominated by an astounding 8 daily newspapers. Of course, this meant reporters from all 8 companies always had to be on the lookout for their next headline. And in 1938, Helen Warden was in Harlem, reporting on a woman who was acquitted of murder. After she received the information she needed, she went on a bit of a walk, crossing just a few blocks down the road, when she stumbled upon a peculiar sight. Before her stood a mansion, 4 stories tall, seemingly abandoned. Several of the windows were shattered, and others had gridiron welded on, and the doors were seemingly blocked off to intruders. Despite its apparent abandonment, there was no for sale sign or for rent sign at the front, which intrigued her. Helen happened to see a woman across the street from the brownstone, and she asked her if she knew anything about the place. The woman instantly lit up, saying, "Oh, that's where Langley Collyer lives. His ma, pa, and brother are supposed to be laying dead in there. Leastwise, nobody's seen them in years. Langley is mighty rich." Helen hung on to every word, and something told her she just found her next story. Less than 24 hours later, she was at the front door of the Collyer mansion. She waited until midnight, when Langley would make his nightly rounds outside. And like clockwork, he stepped out of a back alley door where Helen met him. She described his appearance as white-faced, with a drooping Victorian mustache, a wisp of a man, drifting across the night. Behind him, he dragged a crate with a rope, intending to fill it up with stuff for his brother. For the entire night, Helen walked with him, taking notes for a story, watching as the old man would bend over to pick up junk off the side of the road. Rusted cans, bits of wood, discarded clothing, anything he could find alongside the road. Langley also collected any newspaper he saw, saying that when Homer recovered from his blindness, he would have plenty to catch up on with everything that happened in the meantime. This is what Langley spent the last 6 years doing, ever since his brother went blind. Finally, the pair returned home, and Langley tipped his cap off to Helen, carrying his box of trash inside right behind him. Helen had her story, and she would break it on August 11th, 1938. Within the month, the Collyers were now headlining across all of New York City. This led to the previous rumors now growing exponentially. Some claimed that neither brother believed in banks, instead opting to store their cash inside the mansion, alongside tons of treasure buried and hidden behind junk. Particularly around the children of Harlem, more gruesome rumors spread. That Langley was a serial killer, that he would string bodies up from trees outside his mansion, and that he would store human body parts in his basement. It was also said that an underground tunnel connected the 2 houses owned by the Collyers, and Langley would transport dead bodies between them. 6 weeks after the story broke, the house across from their own, 2077, was broken into, as people searched for the rumored riches, only to leave empty-handed. Still, the brothers were now public figures, and the public was insanely interested in their habits. Crowds would gather outside the mansion, leading to Langley further fortifying his castle of delusion. More grid work was put up, blocking off the windows that children would shatter with rocks. Door handles were tied shut in both the inside and outside handles, And most concerningly, Langley intentionally stacked stuff to form a maze inside his house. Piles of junk were stacked in front of the doors, barring entry from the outside. And if people did make it inside, they were faced with tunnels, connected to a massive labyrinth that stretched throughout all 4 floors of the Collyer mansion. That's not all. Several of the tunnels had intentional wrong turns, armed with tripwires that, when triggered, would bring down piles of junk into any would-be intruders. Now that their house was essentially one massive pile of trash, the Collyers had to make their own living spaces. Their solution? They would build nests on top of the piles, clearing out a circle of junk for them to live in. The Collyers did not want to be in the public eye, but as the days stretched on, the public's interest only grew, and this interest reached the bureaucrats of the city. In 1939, men from the Consolidated Edison Company arrived to take the long-dead gas meters. When the workers showed up, they were met with hostility from Langley. This attention grew a crowd of onlookers, which expanded to hundreds of people strong. In the crowd was reporters and police alike, who escorted the Consolidated workers. They attempted to break down the door to the basement, when Langley appeared in the upper window.
"You have no right to break into my house,"
Langley called down to the cops, who replied, saying the boys just wanted the meters. Langley retreated from the window, and half an hour later, he arrived at the back door. A worker reached for a meter, and Langley attempted to snatch it back. From here, he was hit in the stomach. In a fit of rage, he waved his hands in defeat, shouting,
"Take your meters!"
As he went to walk back inside, he saw Helen in the crowd and shook his fist at her, stating,
"You're to blame for all of this."
And he wasn't wrong. While the Collyers wanted to hide away in the darkness, Helen brought them to light. A light the populace of Harlem only wanted to bask in. It was New Year's, 1940. A citizen of Harlem was out on a stroll, walking through a park, when he saw a curious sight. He watched and saw 2 ghostly men carrying a tree. They shuffled along the street, the man in front leading the one in the back. The man studied them as they held that tree over their shoulders, watching them carry it down the street to their home. The man didn't know it at the time, but he just documented the last time Homer Collyer would ever be seen in public. This was certainly strange. Homer had been blind for 6 years at this point, and he never left the house. Langley would only leave to gather stuff from the streets. So why were they out together that night? While no one fully knows, I want to make a disturbing assumption. I imagine Langley was out late at night on his regular rounds when he saw a tree out in the road. Maybe someone threw out their Christmas tree. After struggling to lift it himself, he would retreat back to his mansion. This wasn't him admitting defeat, it was him going for help. Langley likely woke his blind brother up, helped him navigate through the tight, endless tunnels he had constructed, just to take him out into the streets so that he could help him carry a tree back inside the mansion, perhaps to use for next Christmas. That is just an assumption, but I fail to see another explanation. Again, this was the last time Homer was ever seen in public. 1 year later, in 1941, a small fire broke out in the mansion, and it provoked a response from the fire department. But Langley refused to let them inside, saying he had the fire under control and it was now out. When the firefighters asked if they could see his brother, he refused, saying he wasn't well and wasn't receiving visitors. This was very strange to the firefighters, and it only furthered the rumor that Homer was dead, and his body was being kept inside the mansion, hidden by his brother. So when the NYPD received a call in 1942, reporting a dead body at 2078 Fifth Avenue, the Collyer mansion, Sergeant John Collins was dispatched to investigate it. He arrived at the late night hours, and he knocked on one of the barricaded doors. Langley did reply, and John told him why he was there and that he wasn't leaving until he saw Homer. Langley agreed to let him in, and he led the sergeant through the maze of a building. For 30 minutes, the pair traveled the tunnels before they arrived at a clearing, an empty spot in the walls of junk. Langley told John, "There he is," and as he turned on his flashlight, he almost fell over in fear. There he was indeed, a gray skeleton of a man, skinny, his hair growing down to his knees, a thick winter coat covering his frail body. He was curled into a ball, his knees bent to his face, his eyes empty spheres of white. But he was alive. He called out to the sergeant,
I am Homer L. Collyer, the lawyer, and I want your name and shield number. I am not dead.
John, probably incredibly shocked that this corpse just spoke to him, replied,
Why are your knees up to your chin? I am doubled over by rheumatism. I can never lay down again.
This is part of the reason why Homer was never seen in public again. His body was paralyzed the year prior. He could not move. The rest of his life, however long it may be, would be spent in this nest, hidden away from the public eye. But the public's eyes continued to pry through the shattered glass panes of the Collyer mansion, and soon the banks were about to take a look. In July of 1942, the city of New York placed an eviction notice on the front door of the Collyer mansion, ordering them to the courthouse. This was due to the fact that the brothers had not paid their mortgage in 11 years. To help solve this eviction problem, Langley made a very rare, unprecedented daylight visit, walking down to McMullen's law office, an 8-mile walk there and back. Upon his return, he saw a massive crowd outside his house who all cheered him on, claiming they were on his side and would not let him get kicked out of his house. This warmed Langley's heart. He later said it made him happy to know he had friends who would help support him. While this was great and all, it did not stop the lawyers and the bank from coming after both of them. In the late summer, early fall of 1942, the Health Department of New York sent a crew to clean the exterior of the building. The crew began to move stuff out of the way, which sparked the wrath of Langley. He stood from one of the windows and called down to them.
That's my stuff. You have no right to take my stuff. Police! Police!
The crew replied that the bank had told them to clean the stuff away, furthering the shouts from above.
The bank has nothing to do with this. That's my stuff. You have no right to take it.
The shouting drew a crowd, who all chanted for Langley. This crowd attracted the police, who checked the bank crew's order. One they did not have, so they had to back off, and the Collyers kept their mansion. A few more similar attempts took place, which all ended in failure. That is, until we get to November of 1942. Now fully determined to kick the Collyers out, an army of people were sent there. A banker, 3 lawyers, 7 worksmen, a locksmith named Joseph Cohen, 3 marshals, the fire department, 2 vans full of cops, a physician, a sheriff, and 2 deputies, all ready to breach the door. McMullen tried to resolve it peacefully, knocking on the front door, demanding for Langley to come out. He ignored him, so the breach began. The firefighters put their ladder to view the window that Langley was last seen shouting from, which were now boarded with wood and stacks of newspapers. The sheriff ordered officers to use their hatchets, while the locksmith would take a crack at the storm door, where Langley was last poked in the stomach by the men taking his gas meters. The locksmith did get this door open, where he was met with a 12-foot-high pile of debris, held in place with a wire net. Beyond it, more junk waited for him. Other doors were opened alongside the windows, where similar sights lay upon them all. The crew was ready to give up when the locksmith managed to get a window open, where a semi-empty room greeted him. He shimmied his way inside, where the crowd of men waited for a response, only to never get one. They called out to Cohen, only for him to not reply. A few minutes of silence passed when a deputy crawled in after him. Another few minutes passed when the deputy returned with the locksmith, calling up,
"This is a hell of a mess. Every place we go into is filled with rubbish. I can't even get to the front door."
In 3 hours of work, the men had only made it 2 feet inside of the Collyer mansion. Cohen later told Helen Warden, the reporter who broke the story,
"The trash is like quicksand. When you step in it, you step into space. I know our boys are in the room, but I couldn't find them."
Which, what a disturbing visual. Imagine being in a crew of workers who just tunneled into a massive house filled with junk on every end, and in seconds, you lose everyone else. The only confirmation that you're not alone is the similar sounds of tunneling heard all around you. There are people in this room, but they are buried and unseen. Eventually, enough space was cleared out that the storm door could be taken off the hinges. It was done, and the officers poured into the house. They clambered over the remaining junk when they reached the stairwells to the second floor, where Langley Collyer greeted them. He came downstairs coughing, shouting down to the crowd who just broke into his house.
"Mr. McMullen, Mr. McMullen,"
He shouted out,
"I've been sick for a number of days, and I couldn't attend to affairs. I have your money."
He shouted as he waved a handful of bills like the white flag of surrender. McMullen counted it and was astonished. It was $6,700, enough to pay the mortgage, a modern-day equivalent of $126,000. Now, the brothers owned their house, and the public was off their backs. Life calmed down majorly. The next 4 years saw nothing of major note to take place, and we end up in June of 1946. Police on patrol happened to go past the Collyer mansion when they saw 2 homeless men stealing the copper sewer pipes for the house. The police ordered them to stop, where one fled and one was arrested. Even then, Langley had to show up in court, where he showed up dressed in his typical 1800s style. There was a crowd of reporters there, ready to get their Collyer fix, interviewing him. Then, he returned home, back to Homer. Little did the reporters know, they would be the last people to ever speak to Langley Collyer. In the late hours of March 20th, 1947, the New York Police Department received a call from a man who identified himself as Charles Smith. When asked for his emergency, Smith told the police there is a dead man at 2078 Fifth Avenue. Hardly the first call of this nature they had received, but they investigated it regardless. At 10 p.m., 15 police officers arrived at the Collyer mansion, facing obstacles they were no stranger to. A knock on the door and demands for Langley to open it yielded nothing. Every entrance was locked and barricaded with garbage. So the officers instead opted to break the door down. Several axe strikes hit the front door of the Collyer mansion, and it was eventually chopped through. 2 hours after the officers arrived, they made it inside the mansion, where a stench immediately hit their noses. A musty combination of mildew, age, old wood, and something far more foul greeted them. The first warning sign for what was to come. They continued their path inside the house, moving through the tunnels as they looked for the brothers. They shined their flashlights across the still hoard, watching for any sign of either brother. 15 minutes after the police entered the building, they did find one of the brothers. Homer, located on the second floor, sitting in a cave-like burrow of junk. He sat 6 feet away from a boarded window. His knees were pulled up to his chin, his body emaciated and withered. He was only wearing a tattered gray nightgown, and both his hair and beard had grown long enough to touch his wrist. In his left hand, he held a shriveled apple and a gallon of rancid milk. In his right, he clutched a copy of the Philadelphia Jewish Morning Journal, dated February 22nd, 1920. a newspaper 27 years out of date. Homer Collyer was dead. The cop who found him called out the window to the crowd below.
"One DOA!"
Included in the crowd was Helen Warden, the reporter who first broke the Collyer story. Above, an officer noticed her, and he waved down. He shouted,
"This is your baby, Miss Warden, and the final chapter is being written."
Once it was confirmed that Homer Collyer was dead, his body was wrapped up in a khaki sack sitting close by, and his corpse was carried through a window, down a firefighter's ladder. This was the first time in 7 years that Homer Collyer ever left his house. His body was autopsied at Bellevue Hospital, the very same one his father interned at, and it was determined that his stomach and digestive tract were both empty. Homer died of neglect. Afterwards, he was buried with his parents in the Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn. Homer Collyer was dead, and the Collyer mansion was truly abandoned, being boarded up at 5 o'clock that evening. But there does remain a question, one that was asked amongst the crowd's people. Where was Langley? The Collyer mansion was boarded up at 5 p.m. March 21st, 1945, which happened to be a Friday. The officers went home for the weekend, where they returned on Monday to begin the cleanup effort. In these 3 days, Langley wasn't found. Some believed he was out on an extended shopping spree and would return throughout the weekend. This did not happen. So cleanup crews got busy inside the mansion. That day, a crowd 2,000 strong blocked off Fifth Avenue as they watched the cleanup. A crew thought it would be best to start on the roof, where a hole was cut. From there, they worked their way down, throwing stuff up onto the roof, then down onto the floor below. As things were tossed down, the crowd would cheer. All manner of things were tossed over. Baby carriages, bowling balls, cameras, a horse-drawn carriage, a sawhorse, countless pieces of old furniture, hope chests, rusty bed springs, every instrument imaginable, a staggering 25,000 books, hundreds of yards of silk, sheets on how to learn Braille, advertisements for opera performances, adult photographs, tapestries, bits of machinery, thousands of empty bottles. We could go on for a lot longer. Imagine something someone would use anytime between 1890 to 1945. It was here in the Collyer mansion, now being tossed down to the streets. By the time the cleanup effort was done, 120 tons of junk were removed from the house. Now you already know 120 tons is a lot. It's 240,000 pounds, or 108,862 kilograms for my audience members familiar with the metric. Again, a huge number. Let's put it in a different term. A single Kia Soul weighs at most 2,945 pounds. So the Collyers had an equivalent of 81.5 Kia Souls in their 4-story house. Cleanup crews worked in shifts of 15 minutes as the smell on the building was unbearable. Meanwhile, the press was dying to squeeze every drop of content they could out of the story, and their focus was on the search for Langley. Some outlets, in exchange for tips, offered $1,000. Some offered $1,500, a modern-day equivalent of $17,000 to $26,000 today. Even before the true search for Langley began, a man reported a sighting of him. A lawyer claimed to have seen an old, decrepit man that Friday morning, but thought nothing of it until he saw his picture in the press. Tons of similar sightings popped up. 3 people in Brooklyn reported an old man attempting to rent a room. A real estate broker told police that a man in Brooklyn came to him and said, "I've lived in a place for many a years, and now I need to get out." Some said he was in the subway, hitching train rides out of the city. A man even claimed that he received a letter from Langley, demanding the search to be called off, which sparked further curiosity. Was Langley Collyer on the run? Was he intentionally evading police? Another neighbor came forward, stating that Langley once told her something kind of disturbing. She spoke with him in February of 1945, and she asked how he was. Langley replied,
"And not so good. My brother isn't well. If he dies, I'm going to jump in the river. He's all I have to live for."
By the time the search was over, sightings of Langley were reported in 9 total states, with 1 even being reported in North Carolina. The search for Langley was slowly turning into a nationwide effort, but there were hopes that it would come to an end. The police and public believed that Langley would attend Homer's funeral, which took place on April 1st, 1945. 53 people were in attendance, but among them was not his brother. Homer was buried in an unmarked grave about a quarter mile from his parents. The search for Langley persisted. People across the 5 boroughs of New York City were on high alert. Basically, any old elderly man was reported to the police. It got to the point that one old man walked around with a sign on his front saying, "I am not Langley Collyer." A body was spotted in the Bronx, floating in the river, which briefly was believed to be Langley. After an autopsy, it was found to not be him. But let's take a break from the search and get back to the cleanup of the house. A crew had transitioned to the basement, but were quickly pulled back. There were concerns that the building was unstable, and if enough stuff from the bottom was pulled out, the entire house would collapse in on itself. So the effort resumed to a top-to-bottom cleaning. More strange finds were reported. Old mattresses, broken furniture, rusted bicycle frames, and an entire armory of guns. Yes, workmen on the 3rd floor found a collection of pistols, shotguns, rifles, and bullets and shells for them all. A new concern had just came across the workmen: the traps that Langley built. One police officer pushed into the main hall of the house, only to trigger an avalanche of jugs, lumber, bales of paper, and scraps of metal, which all rained down onto his head. He was injured, but did survive. One detective was crawling through a narrow tunnel when he triggered a trap that brought down 2 pieces of concrete that each weighed 75 pounds, alongside a pile of crowbars and jars of human excrement and urine. It's unclear if the jars were opened or not. Workmen were receiving $120 a day to clean the house up, a modern-day equivalent of $2,159, which, hell, sign me up. But now, it's time to get a little more serious. The cleanup was continuing through the basement when they uncovered something disgusting. In the basement, hidden behind shelves, were jars filled with formaldehyde. And inside these jars, human organs floated. And another one, a 2-headed fetus, was inside. This was one of the rumors, and the police just proved it to be true. Now, was Langley or Homer a serial killer? Probably not, but something equally as disturbing may reveal why they were here. Their father was a doctor, and when he died in 1917, they took everything he had, which likely included these organs. So for 30 years, human remains sat in jars at the bottom of the Collyer mansion. Other junk was found: 12 ornate clocks, an accordion, a cello, a static machine, a horse's jawbone, and an early version of an X-ray. As they continued to clean through Herman's collection, they found a brand new shirt with a scarlet tie. A birthday card was attached, dated October 3rd, 1915. It read, "To Langley, with many happy returns this day, Pop." The price tag was still attached, and the shirt had never been worn. The search continued, and 2 cleaners were on the 2nd floor when they noticed the smell of the mansion was far, far worse right here. They continued to poke through the floor when the workers noticed a pile of newspapers, and the stench was at its absolute worst. One of the workers ordered the other to look under them, and so he did. He lifted the newspapers and began to dig them out, when he immediately fell back, screaming,
"Jesus Christ, I've got him by the toe!"
Langley Collyer was just found. On March 9th, 1945, Langley was spending the night like he had spent so many others before, taking care of Homer. He had some food he was attempting to give to his brother, and he was climbing through a tunnel to get there, when he accidentally triggered one of the traps he built to keep intruders out. A pile of junk fell on Langley, including rusty bed springs, a chest of drawers, a suitcase, and an old sewing machine. He reached his hand out to Homer, but it was no use. Langley Collyer died on March 9th, 1945, 10 feet away from his blind brother. For the next 12 days, Homer sat, a few feet away from the window, a few feet away from his brother, as he slowly starved to death. When that anonymous man, Charles Smith, made the call about a dead body in the house on March 20th, he wasn't talking about Homer, he was talking about Langley. It just so happens that Homer had died a few hours before the call was placed. After Homer was found and the search for Langley began, no one in the Collyer mansion could have predicted that he was mere feet away from them. So, for the next 19 days, workmen cleaned the mansion up, while Langley sat and rotted right beside of them. When he was found, his body was badly decomposed. Rats had eaten away half of his face, his feet, and his hands. But there was no doubt in anyone's mind. This was Langley Collyer. He was wearing 4 pairs of pants but no underwear, alongside a red flannel bathrobe. His body was taken out, and he was buried next to his brother at the Cypress Hill Cemetery. Now what? That seemed to be the question on the public's mind, and the answer was the same as before. Clean the mansion up. The crew worked on it for weeks, and the stuff inside was auctioned off in a series of sales. Local museums made a big part of the purchases, most notably an old school desk that Homer had carved his initials in, and, more gruesome, the chair Homer had died in. Other objects were sold to varying people, and the Collyer collection reached a staggering $1,892, a modern-day equivalent of $34,000. Once the building was fully cleaned out, it was deemed to be too unsafe, and it was razed to the ground less than 6 months after Langley was buried. The story of the Collyers had came to a close. For the better part of 15 years, the brothers lived in isolation, hidden away from the public. And the brothers may have just picked the most pivotal 15 years to hide away from. They completely stayed inside during the Great Depression, the Harlem race riots, World War II, and the atomic bombing of Japan. Langley actually did comment on the atomic bombing, stating he didn't believe an actual atom was split. I thought then that the atomic bombing was just a fanciful name. The method is more like a rapid release of nitrogen gas. At the former site of the Collyer mansion sits a park and memorial to the brothers. Today, firefighters still refer to the Collyers when encountering a hoarder house. If a house is filled with stuff and difficult to enter and navigate, they will say, "We've got a Collyer," instantly invoking that idea of a crowded disaster. Perhaps Claremont Morris said it best. Their house was like an Egyptian tomb, a house filled with items collected throughout their entire lives that then transitioned into their final resting place. Thank you all so much for watching.